From the enormous pool of data that Ainsworth and her students had collected in natural situations, they discovered much about the changes in babies' attachment behaviors across the first year of life and about the relationships between infant and maternal behavior. For example, contrary to the opinions of most experts since the 1880s, Ainsworth found that babies whose mothers had responded to their cries quickly and sensitively when they were in their first 6 months of life cried much less as one-year-olds.
Read a book with Mommy. How about Bobo? Hey, Caroline, can you close the door, please?
They were also more compliant or obedient later in the first year,
Good job.
cooperating with necessary transitions. They also explored more and developed new cognitive skills sooner than babies whose mothers had been less sensitive to their early needs and signals.
You're right. You must be hungry.
Mothers who allowed the baby to set the timing and the pace of feedings
You want some broccoli? All right.
tended to have less difficult and more secure children by the end of the first year. Ainsworth thought that the sensitivity of the primary caregiver in terms of picking up cues from the baby and responding to them appropriately is probably the key factor in establishing secure attachments in infancy. Later studies have found that the infant's temperaments, whether they were edgy or placid, quiet or active, were not at all as important in predicting individual differences in the baby's attachments. Sensitive caregivers seem to adjust themselves to the individual characteristics of their babies. Ainsworth concluded from her Uganda and Baltimore studies that this sensitive caregiving led a baby to treat his attachment figure as a haven of safety when things seemed unsafe or overwhelming. For example, notice how the baby immediately reaches for his mother as I approach him too closely. The baby also uses his mother as a secure base or base camp from which to move off and explore and develop new competence when he is soothed and or feeling comfortable.
Want to read it?
This two-part function of the caregiver for the child, that she serves as a haven of safety and as a secure base, is a basic premise of attachment theory. In order to validate her home observations, Ainsworth developed a standardized laboratory procedure that has become an important tool in the study of children between the ages of about 10 months and 5 or 6 years. It is called the strange situation because, in fact, it is just that for the baby or young child. The child and the caregiver enter a room that has lots of toys and some chairs. The caregiver puts the child on the floor to explore.
Is it a shape sorter? There are shapes.
After about 3 minutes, an adult stranger comes in.
Hello. Hi.
I'm Dr. Philippides. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Nice to meet
Nice
you.
to meet you. This is Caroline.
Hello, Caroline.
Sits down and briefly chats with the caregiver.
How was your trip here?
It was fine. We had no trouble
No
finding
trouble?
it.
Did you?
And then begins to play with the child.
Oh,
And
look
it's
at
a-
your corn. And it's a beautiful day.
It is a gorgeous day. Caroline didn't want to come inside.
I don't blame her. Going to throw that? Yes, keep it to roll it. Oh, thanks. It's coming back to you. Oh, you kicked it. Oh, he wants wants ice cream, or you want ice cream.
The caregiver then leaves and the stranger interacts with the baby.
Mommy will be back. Come. Come. Mommy will be back. Let's play together. It's okay. Mommy will be back. Oh, I know. Mommy will be back. It's okay. It's okay. Shall we play with the toys? Shall we play with the toys? Huh? Do you want to sit on here?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Come on. Put one foot up. One foot up. And up you go. Now you're on a truck. Now you're on a truck. And you can push. Can you push? You want him to ride with you? I know. She'll be back. I know. Oh. Mommy will be back. Mommy's coming now. Okay. Mommy's coming back. Mommy's going to come back.
The caregiver signals her return and enters.
Caroline. Hi. Hi, sweetie. Did you miss Mommy? Did you miss Mommy?
Reunites with the baby and interacts with the baby while the stranger
Are you
leaves.
making a sign for Mama's milk?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not time for that right now. But we can play with some toys. Let's play with some toys. Do you see a big dinosaur? And do you see a tiger? Let's see if we can find the tiger. I think we can find him. Hi. Hey, sweetie.
After a few minutes, the caregiver again leaves.
Okay, Caroline. Mommy's gonna go bye-bye. Mommy's gonna go bye-bye. I'll be right back. I'm gonna go bye-bye. I'll be back soon. I'll be back soon. Just a minute.
This time, the baby is alone. The stranger comes back in and tries to interact with the baby, trying to soothe her if she's upset.
I know. Come. Mommy's coming. Mommy's going to come. Mommy's going to come. Come. Let's see. Can we play here?
Finally, the caregiver returns.
Oh, sweet.
We have speeded up this procedure for this video. It normally lasts 21 minutes. Okay. Ainsworth found several intriguing patterns. First, babies who cried the least at home, whose attachments with their mothers were secure, often cried more than other babies in the separations in the lab. They reacted to the loss of their haven of safety in this strange setting by becoming visibly upset. Interestingly, it wasn't the baby's behavior at separation that was the most important. It was the baby's behavior on reunion that was the most telling part of this experience. Babies securely attached to their mothers, like the one you just saw, tended to go to their mothers to be picked up. They were quickly soothed and then returned to happy exploration. Ainsworth found that 66% of the Baltimore pairs had these secure attachments. She also found 2 categories of anxious or insecure attachments, which we here illustrate with animations of actual lab footage to protect privacy. Some babies were less obviously upset by the separation, and at reunion were slow to initiate contact with their caregivers. In Ainsworth's study, 21% of the pairs were in this avoidant category of attachment. Another category of babies, labeled as having insecure, ambivalent, resistant attachments, did less initial exploration and were obviously highly distressed by the separations. It was very difficult for their mothers to calm them on reunion, and the babies tended to show ambivalent behaviors such as kicking and arching their backs. These made up 13% of the original sample. Several years later, after studying many strange situations, Judith Solomon and Mary Main, a former student of Ainsworth's, identified a 4th category called disorganized. These babies were utterly overwhelmed by the experience. Some seemed momentarily terrified by their parents' reentry. Others approached and then retreated with a dazed expression, unable to make an organized response to their distress. Further research by Main and others has shown that most children with this disorganized pattern have been raised in families who have suffered some significant loss, trauma, or maltreatment. For all these babies, whatever category, the strange situation triggered attachment behaviors they had developed in their first months of life. The patterns have proven to be quite stable over time and to color future interpersonal relationships.